Imagine waking up one morning and being told your neighbor has accused you of flying through the night sky, of poisoning the crops, of making a pact with the devil himself. You haven't. You know you haven't, but it doesn't matter. Because in Europe, between the years of 1450 and 1750, the accusation was enough. No defense would save you. No alibi would protect you. The moment someone pointed a finger and whispered the word, witch, your life was effectively over. We are talking about a continent-wide killing machine that operated for 300 years. That tortured confessions out of innocent people. That burned, hanged and drowned somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 human beings, the majority of them women, for a crime that was never real. This is not a story about magic. This is a story about fear, about power, about what happens when society needs a monster and decides to build one out of its most vulnerable people. Welcome to the darkest chapter of European history. To understand the European witch hunts, you need to understand one book. In 1486, two German Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published a text called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This was not a fringe document. This was endorsed by Pope Innocent VIII himself. It was one of the first books mass-produced on Gutenberg's printing press, and it became the definitive manual for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches across all of Europe. The Malleus told inquisitors exactly what a witch was. Almost always a woman. Why? Because, as the text explained with chilling confidence, women are more credulous, more impressionable, and, in one of the most revealing lines in the history of misogyny, because they have slippery tongues. The book detailed precise methods of torture to extract confessions. It explained that accused witches could not be trusted, so even if they denied being a witch under torture, that denial itself could be taken as proof of guilt. Think about that. You confess, you're a witch. You refuse to confess. You're a witch hiding behind the devil's protection. There was no exit from this logic, and for 300 years, European society operated inside it. So who exactly was being accused? The answer is almost heartbreaking in its predictability. The typical witch trial victim was an older woman, often widowed, often poor, often someone who lived on the margins of her community, a herbalist, a midwife, a healer, someone who knew too much about plants and medicine, someone who had property that her neighbors coveted, someone who had argued with the wrong person. In village after village, the pattern repeated itself. A cow died. A child fell ill. The harvest failed. And the community, terrified, desperate for an explanation, looked for someone to blame. The strange old woman on the edge of the village. The widow who kept to herself. The herbalist whose remedies hadn't worked. In many cases, accused witches were also simply inconvenient. Historians have noted that a striking number of witch trial victims were women who had inherited property from their husbands, property that, once they were convicted and executed, passed to male relatives or was confiscated by the church and the state. The witch was never random. She was chosen. When an accused witch was brought before the inquisitors, the question was never really whether she was guilty. The question was how long it would take her to confess. The Malleus Maleficarum had authorized a full range of enhanced interrogation, what we would simply call torture. Strappado, where the arms were bound behind the back and the victim was hoisted into the air by a rope, then dropped, dislocating the shoulders. The rack. The boot, which crushed the feet and legs. Sleep deprivation for days at a time. And these methods worked, not because they revealed truth, but because they manufactured it. Under sufficient pain, a person will confess to anything. They will name names. They will describe in vivid, elaborate detail Sabbaths they never attended, rituals they never performed, and co-conspirators who are just as innocent as they are. Those named co-conspirators were then arrested, then tortured. Then they named more names. This is how witch panic spread. Not because witchcraft was real, but because torture generates an ever-expanding list of the guilty. In some German towns during the height of the panic in the 1600s, entire villages were effectively exterminated. In Würzburg, the Prince Bishop executed nearly 300 people in just a few years, including members of his own family, and, in one particularly chilling case, the most beautiful girl in the city, whose only recorded crime was being considered too beautiful to be innocent. The witch hunts were not evenly distributed across Europe, and this distribution tells us something crucial. The regions most devastated by witch trials were not the most superstitious or backward. They were the most politically fragmented. The Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany and its surroundings, suffered by far the highest death tolls. Why? Because it was divided into hundreds of tiny competing principalities, each with its own court system, each with its own local power struggles, and none with the kind of centralized authority that could pump the brakes. Meanwhile, in England, where the Crown maintained tighter control over the legal system, witch executions numbered in the hundreds rather than the tens of thousands. In Spain, paradoxically, the deeply feared Spanish Inquisition was actually more skeptical of witch trial evidence than local secular courts, and executed far fewer accused witches than most of Northern Europe. This pattern destroys a comfortable myth that the witch hunts were simply a product of religious fanaticism or medieval ignorance. The worst massacres happened in places with the weakest rule of law, where local grudges, political competition, and personal vendettas could be settled in a courtroom dressed up as a holy war. The witch was a weapon, and weapons are picked up by whoever has a use for them. Here is the detail that haunts historians most. Not everyone believed. Even at the height of the witch panic, there were voices, educated, respected, influential voices, who said clearly, "This is wrong. These people are innocent. The confessions are extracted by torture and therefore worthless. There are no witches." As early as 1563, a German physician named Johann Weyer published a landmark text arguing that so-called witches were not servants of the devil, but mentally ill women being persecuted by a credulous legal system. He was ridiculed, denounced, and largely ignored. In the early 1600s, a Jesuit priest named Friedrich Spee, assigned to hear the final confessions of convicted witches, became so horrified by what he witnessed that he wrote a secret manuscript detailing the systematic injustice of the trials. He published it anonymously in 1631 at enormous personal risk. He wrote that he had never, in all his confessions, encountered a single woman he believed to be truly guilty. Not one. These men existed, they spoke, and society chose not to listen. Because the witch hunts were never really about witchcraft. They were about what the witch represented, a container for every anxiety, every grievance, every fear that a community could not otherwise process. When the need for that container finally faded, when scientific thinking took hold, when centralized legal systems demanded evidence, when the social conditions that made scapegoating necessary began to shift, the trials stopped almost as quickly as they had started. The last major witch execution in Europe was carried out in 1782 in Switzerland. A woman named Anna Goldie was beheaded for allegedly poisoning a child. The Enlightenment was in full force. Voltaire was alive. The American Revolution had already happened. Think about that. 1782. 40,000 to 60,000 people. Executed over 3 centuries. For nothing. The European witch hunts are so often filed away as a relic of superstitious times. A story we tell ourselves to feels superior to the past. But the mechanism that drove them is not extinct. The pattern is always the same. A society under pressure, a vulnerable group without institutional protection, a legal system willing to accept accusation as evidence, and a community hungry for someone to blame. It is a machine that has been assembled many times throughout history, and every time it is assembled, people die. The women of the European witch trials were not witches. They were neighbors. They were mothers. They were healers. and they were burned alive by a world that needed a monster more than it needed the truth. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like, comment down below your thoughts on any of the witch trials I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see a part 2 or more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.